What I saw a few years ago when we had those budget cuts is out in the departments, staff members were cut, accountants were cut, administrative assistants were cut, and so you had more duties left for fewer people. And oftentimes, too, in the department, especially for faculty members, they're really happy if an accountant or a business officer or an administrative assistant is volunteering to take over all parts of the transaction. And yet that's really a dangerous position because they order the transaction, they authorize it, and now if they're the ones looking at the management report too, there's no ability to oversee that, and there's a ripe opportunity for fraud. Another one would be separating the physical control of the assets with recording and reconciling, so you'd have somebody different do inventory and recording of assets. So an authorization example would be you'd only delegate your signature to the extent it's really necessary. So for example, you go on vacation. Again, you wouldn't want to delegate your authority back to that same person who has these other functions on a regular basis. And then personnel should understand what they're signing. So I know a lot of us sometimes we're faced with a stack of papers and we say to ourselves, oh, I trust that person, and we don't go over the detail. And maybe that's okay, but periodically anyway, you should be looking at your high dollar transactions and making sure the documentation is there, that you pre-authorize that transaction, you understand it, or even looking at your low dollar transactions and sampling and making sure again that everything's there that needs to be for your authorization. A simple one would be, of course, computer resources or password protected. We hear about that all the time in the news, so a security breach. Examples of control over assets would be your periodic asset counts, and that is required by policy at least once a year. We physically safeguard our assets. They're recorded and they're insured. They're kept in locked rooms. We have proper authorization for purchases, and policy says that once it's over $5,000, we really need to involve purchasing. We get a PO. That gives us the protections that we need with the vendor as far as returns and, again, proper authorization. And that if you do have a discrepancy, that you do investigate. Some other examples. Now, this is typically what your group would do. So it's monitoring. You have the oversight. And again, policy tells you you have this oversight. So you want to know what your high-risk areas are. If you have hundreds of employees, that's a high-risk area. If you have cash, again, that's always high risk. If you order a lot of equipment, again, so know what your risk points are for your department. Again, we have those budgets for a reason, and you need to periodically check those. This doesn't need to be detailed every month, but at least once a quarter, so that you know again. So your budget protects you. If there's a reason you have a 5,000 supplies budget and it's already 10,000, you're only partway through the year, it's time to ask some questions. We just had a situation lately. This was a department where they had a lot of employees, and this particular person was the payroll reporter. She was responsible for terminating employees, but she waited to terminate employees, and then she would go and say, oh, you were overpaid. So her department name, she opened up a side bank account with the acronym from her department name, and then she would collect the money from the overpaid, either scholarship recipient or employee, and then deposit in her personal bank account. And we only discovered it later when an employee last year got their W-2 and said, oh, but there was that few $1,000s they paid back. Why isn't it reflected in my W-2? So we wouldn't have known otherwise. Okay, so reviewing the management statements, that's one of the best tools that we have for your monitoring. And we have a training specifically on management reports, so I hope that you're aware these are available electronically, and there's a lot of information. So you can always export to Excel, or you can look online and you can see that, oh, my travel budget's $2,000, I've already spent $5,000. You can click on that $5,000 and actually see the detail. Oh yeah, I authorized this, and money's going to come in later to pay for that. So there's really a lot that you can do with the management reports, and we have a separate training on that. We're happy to do for your department, so you can come in and we can go into your activities and actually show you some tools that we have, and we can analyze some things that you can look for. Again, you want to sample and spot check even routine type transactions. You want to review your payroll summaries. Back in the old days, we used to get an earnings and benefits report every pay period, and so it was easy to check our employees. Now we've got to go and we've got to pull that report. So it's not as easy, but periodically, again, you need to go out there and make sure that the people on your list of employees are those who you expect. They're being paid what you expect. This is a big one. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but follow up on complaints, rumors, and allegations. Travel, again, is high risk, so you want to periodically check your supporting documentation, especially during your sign-off. And then again, if you have some high-risk areas and you want to do some troubleshooting even in advance, it's great to contact internal audit. Okay, so what do you need to be doing for your internal control system? Again, we talked about the risks. You best know what your risks are, and figure out what those control points are, and ask yourself, okay, so what could go wrong, and focus on those high-risk areas. And again, your system should include separation of duties. That's in our policy, best business practices, and you will get the most out of your internal controls if you can facilitate that. So what are some red flags of fraud? Unexplained variances. Again, that budget to actual, rumors, allegations, lack of reconciliation. So you have an accountant who does the reconciliation. They're supposed to bring the management report to your review. You ask for those, and oh, they're too busy, they haven't gotten to them, or they lost a few months. That's a red flag. You ask for a report, and it just happens to be missing. An employee won't take a vacation. You know, if they're committing fraud, maybe it's too good of a gig and they don't want to be discovered, or it's just too lucrative, they don't want to take a vacation. Even amounts on checks and documents. Somebody has the original documentation, so why not check that in your department? If you never see original documentation, that's a red flag. Using exemptions, that's another red flag. So I'm going to help illustrate some of these things with some statistics. And this is from the Occupational Fraud and Abuse, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. I hope you can see this. Okay, so we do background checks, right? So we should be good. But it turns out that only a very small percentage of people that commit fraud had any type of a prior conviction. About 10% had been previously terminated, but oftentimes too, a prior employer might terminate them, might not have the resources to prosecute, didn't fully investigate and weren't sure, so they're not going to report to you. So it's really hard to know if you're hiring somebody who had a prior related conduct item. But there are some behavioral traits, so let's talk about those. Unfortunately, so whether you put us in government or not-for-profit, it can take 2 years to discover fraud. A lot of wrong can occur in 2 years, but that's the average amount of time it takes to detect fraud. So how do we detect fraud? Almost half the time it's by a tip. So if you have an employee who comes to you and says, you know, something doesn't feel right, or, you know, I know this person only has this type of job, their husband's out of work, they just bought a new car, it just is weird. They don't want to accuse somebody of fraud, and so they're going to give you kind of a soft tip. But that is how most fraud is detected. So again, if you hear a rumor, it's always worth following up. Oftentimes it's just by accident. We had a by accident just lately where an employee went to the campus store and purchased a computer. Well, that sounds reasonable enough, but why were they requesting reimbursement from a payment request? The typical method is if a department wants to purchase a computer at the campus store, they use a campus order. And it turns out that this person had just recycled a receipt from somebody else and thought she was on her way to getting a couple $1,000s reimbursed for a computer that she actually never purchased. So it was really just by accident because one of my processors said, why didn't they use a campus order? 20% of the time it's by internal audit, but that's not a high number. Again, you have internal audit come out. They may or may not detect fraud in your area. Internal controls, as much as I've talked about it today, it's, again, much less successful of detecting fraud than a tip. But what helps an employee commit fraud? It's the lack of internal control. So again, we need to be asking ourselves, what can we do? Because of good internal control, it's going to prevent fraud. And that's our goal. We don't want to catch it, we want to prevent it. Okay, so who commits fraud? 40% of the time it's somebody who makes less than $50,000, but you can see that, and this is from 2008, 30% of the time they're making a fairly good income. That's average for a family of 4 in Utah. So you like to think that there's not a lot of financial pressure on these higher income people, but 10% of the time they're making over $100,000 and they still commit fraud. So you're really not, you can't not initiate internal controls on any income level. More often than not, it's a male that commits fraud, but it's not, it's fairly even. Generally, when men commit fraud, it is a greater dollar amount. So when the average loss of a male fraud in 2008 was a couple $100,000. For a woman, it was about $100,000. It also happens at all degree levels. So we like to think that we're insulated being on campus. We have all these bright people. They at least have a bachelor's. Many have PhDs. But we have people 10% of the time, if they already have a postgraduate degree and they're still committing fraud. Questions. I'm just going to mention again briefly about this additional training where, again, this group, what you can offer best is your monitoring. You know your department, you know what type of transactions you expect to see, you know your budget. So really understand that management report and how you can drill into the detail and how you can read that. And we're happy to give additional training on management reports, either at your location or our location. So we'd love to hear from you. Questions on anything I talked about today? Or yes?
So I think I feel pretty good about non-personnel costs on the management report and so on, but all of those salary numbers and everything are very hard to monitor, and I assume that it's being drawn. So it sounded like maybe things we need to be looking for are there people listed there that aren't really employees, or are there other, what do you recommend when looking at personnel costs?
So shortly after your budget starts, so certainly after July 1st, maybe August, you're pulling your earnings and benefits report, and of course making sure that all those salaries are correct. And then if you have a lot of employees that go in and out, you're really going to want to watch your dates. And maybe that is something that you delegate, but again, you'd want to verify. So if you know that somebody was terminated again, you'd want to make sure that it happened at the right period of time. Yes?
Is the university be audited, I assume, like a small nonprofit, and when they come in, there's external auditors, how far do they drill down to college department level? What are they looking at?
They,
Audited every year.
so at the overall aggregate university level, we are audited by the state auditor's office, and they sample transactions, but their goal is to make sure that the university's financial statements are materially correct. And because we're such a large organization with, I can't think of how many assets we have, but over $1 billion in assets, their materiality level is very high. So they're not going to look at your small dollar transactions and may not drill down into a department at all. So we can't rely on our overall external auditors to help you find fraud. That would be more like internal audit function if you have, risk point that you wanted to look at. And again, scary enough, but as department leaders, policy says that's your responsibility. So we want to give you the tools, but at the budget that's assigned to you, that's your department leadership's responsibility. Yes.
The university also does have an internal audit
Yes.
department, right? How do they visit every college and department on a periodic basis?
I don't know that they visit everybody. Some of the bigger departments are on a 3-year or a 5-year rotation. They also have a tip line, so if somebody gave a tip on a particular department, they would come out, and if there's suspected fraud, they'd come out immediately.
So they don't have a mandate to audit every department?
Yeah, and they don't report to me, so I can't say. I don't know that I think they do try to hit every department, but I can't imagine that it's very frequently if they're hitting all 300. Yes.
Just as a follow-up on that, in the College of Pharmacy, we actually have called internal audit where we suspected fraud and had them do an internal audit at our place. And they can do, I've actually worked with them on this, they can actually do it without even coming to the college. And you can pull the actual receipts, you can look at them. It's very interesting to go through that process.
Yeah. And we can help you too. So for example, if you have a particular employee that you just want to check, we can drill down and run reports and look for all the payment requests that that person initiated. So we also do statistical sampling on my side. We call it post-audit. So our processors try to catch things before they're processed. But even on the back end, once everything is processed, we do a sample of 5%. And so you might even hear from us every now and then when we do a back end audit, didn't have the right approval or the documentation doesn't quite add up. But again, it's just not quite the volume that we'd like. We're not staffed to do the checks that we'd like to do to be really comprehensive, and you're probably not either. So that's why, again, we want to focus on our highest risk areas. Yes.
What if we were interested in having you come into college just to assess how good our internal controls are and point out weaknesses, as much as the auditors do for small nonprofits, and they suggest some of the things you talked about, like separation of duties.
Right.
Do you do that? Does your office do kind of
We don't do that, but we could. We certainly can help you with that. Internal audit also looks at separation of duties and internal controls when they do come out and audit.
I mean, from the case here, it's probably social work. I think everything's fine. I don't know if anyone was prosecuted, but there's some risk areas that we should pay attention to now before something does become. That's what I'm.
Okay, and then I don't mean to ruin your trust in people, but always when we uncover fraud, this is what we hear from the department. Oh, we trusted them. And so again, as an employer, all we've got to work with is that opportunity line. And so we want to protect our employees by, again, making sure that we've got our internal control set up as adequately as we can, so that they're not tempted, but we don't want to mistrust our employees, but we don't want to overtrust employees for their own protection. Yes?
So we're relatively small, and this separation of duties sometimes gets in the way. But I seem to have gotten from your presentation that it's not necessarily a black and white thing. If I do invoices, then I can, so sometimes I have people say to me, I do invoices, therefore I can never accept payments. But if that person does invoices for X, Y, and Z and not A, B, and C, is
Yes.
that a way that we can still separate
That is.
responsibilities?
Right. But I'm also, I want to give you some confidence that even if you're very small and you do have a lot of power concentrated in one person, provided you have that oversight, that monitoring, you're looking at your management reports, that's still a really good separation of duty. And that's always available to you as an account executive, that you have this monitoring. Thank you very much.